Welcome to the Whiskey Vault. I'm Daniel Whittington, Chancellor of Wizard Academy and Whiskey Marketing School. Hear that sound? I'll pause. It's raining very hard outside, and the rain dumps from the roof of the building straight onto a metal roof that is about 3 feet away from me on the other side of this wall. You're going to hear it the whole video. Sorry. Okay, today we're going to talk about yeast. Now, I'm going to separate yeast from fermentation. I'm going to do a separate video on fermentation. Today, we're just going to talk about yeast because we're nerds, and it's nerd time. Welcome, my children. Yeast is a single, good Lord, cell organism. Oh, nice fake cork. Love that. That feeds on sugars, producing alcohol, carbon dioxide, and heat, along with flavor compounds. So, single cell organism eats sugar, creates alcohol, carbon dioxide, heat, and flavors known as congeners. There are many species of yeast. Wild yeast, it numbers what? I think there's like 1,500 listed species of yeast. But there's a specific one we use in distilling that comes under the umbrella of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And it is a yeast species specific to distilling. There's variations on it. It's a roughly 10 micron organism, and it's about 1, I think, billion cells per gram of yeast. Heyo, how's that for some nerdy stuff for you? Yeast propagates by what's called budding, which is when a daughter cell grows from a mother cell and then breaks off to form a new cell. In the presence of oxygen, yeast takes that sugar and uses it to grow and spread and multiply, right? And it forms more yeast or more biomass. And then, under anaerobic conditions, which means once it runs out of oxygen, it switches to producing alcohol, right? It metabolizes the sugar and creates alcohol as a byproduct. This is known as fermentation, and this is literally how you create alcohol. It was wild fermentation when it was done with wine vats and mead and beer in the early days, and then it became more intentional and more controlled. Yeast metabolizes the sugar to release alcohol as a byproduct, but it also generates 3 other things like we talked about: heat, carbon dioxide, and most important for this conversation, congeners, which is flavor compounds. So we need yeast to do 2 different things in a fermentation for us as whiskey distillers. We need it to create ethanol, alcohol, because otherwise we don't have alcohol. But we don't want just plain old alcohol. Alcohol doesn't have a flavor. Ethanol, just a standalone ethanol, doesn't really have a flavor. It needs other compounds to create all the things we know and love that will interact with the barrel and the cuts and everything to produce the whiskey that we drink like this. And that's when, for about 48 hours, it creates alcohol. And then because of several things, it dies off. And that is, it could be because it runs out of food. It could be because it's producing too much heat and the heat kills it off, which is why you do temperature-controlled fermentations. It could just be life cycle, or here's the other thing. Ironically, alcohol kills yeast. So yeast eat the sugar and produce alcohol, and eventually the alcohol level gets high enough that it kills the yeast that are left, even in a temperature-controlled fermentation. And at that point, they break down. It's called autolysis, and that's something we'll talk about after we do the whiskey, because it's an important part of the production process. And I'm not going to talk about secondary fermentations and things like that right now. We're just going to try to stick to yeast. This is Nelson Brothers whiskey. I don't know if you remember, but the Nelson Brothers were the people who originally launched because they found that one of their ancestors was a bootlegger, and they wanted to revive his name, so they did in Tennessee, and I think in Nashville, and they released Belle Meade products, which I really dug. As a matter of fact, my first introduction to a Madeira finish was Belle Meade Madeira cask bourbon, and I loved it. And I was talking to somebody about this recently at a tasting. It was like one of the first videos they found. And I loved that one. It taught me that I liked Madeira cask finished things. As they started making their own stuff, they released it under the brand Nelson Brothers. Now, I will tell you, this is not theirs. They contract distilled it with Bardstown. Doesn't mean anything good or bad, it just is. Bardstown makes great whiskey, right? But they went with a different mash bill. Ooh, that's like very quickly, all of a sudden, for no apparent reason, my brain said Dr. Pepper. It's very weird. They swapped the mash. This is 64 rye, 30 corn, 6% malted barley. This is a really high corn rye. And okay, now that note of Dr. Pepper's gone, but I am getting this almost soda syrup sweetness with a little bit of sarsaparilla and then cut grain, like a slight green note. That's almost vegetation. And then it's a little baked cinnamon. It smells great because, man, Bardstown makes really good whiskey. Really vanilla, really soft, really creamy. What's the proof on this? 46.25. The palate on this is just beautifully soft and gentle. And yeah, I'm trying to think what else is there. It turned everything that I just described into the vanilla cream version of everything I just described, as if it was a horchata. That tastes delicious. That is one of the more creamy, kind of soft and pretty ryes that I've had in a very long time. If you really like, it's a polar opposite of something like Far North or Dad's Hat or like these really like, heck yeah, rye. This is way more of like almost a Kentucky drinker's rye, like a bourbon drinker's rye. But I like it. I like it a lot, actually. I like the palate, ironically. I like the palate more than the nose, even though it's softer. Anyway, very interesting. Now, I know that it was two brothers, Andy and Charlie Nelson. One of them stepped down recently. I don't remember which one, and the remaining brother is running the show. Okay, let's get back into yeast, nerds. So, yeast strains specifically have to be propagated in order to handle high alcohol content, or else, you know, they'll die out so early that you get these fermentations that are 3%, 4% ABV. That is a massive waste of money. So over world history, yeast strains have been sort of guided and altered and guided and crafted to produce really high levels of alcohol for yeast. I mean, up there to 10, 12%, 8% on the low end. Like that's considered efficient yeast production, and those are often referred to as turbo yeast or distiller's yeast. These are different things, but yeast, they ferment faster and they'll go longer when it's made for distilling. There's a thing called autolysis, which is when yeast dies, it sort of like feeds in on itself, breaks apart, decomposes, and that thing that it lets go as it decomposes into the fermentation is what helps create a whole lot of these really interesting flavor profiles. And the flavor profile changes completely based on the yeast. And so you get esters and aldehydes primarily, which are under the parent category of congeners, right? And esters are all the really sweet, banana, pear, pineapple, cherry. If you ever have a malt or a whiskey that's like really fruity, those are esters. Aldehydes will show up as sometimes salt, umami, also cinnamon, citrus, sometimes vanillin, rose. It's a very different thing. But the thing about aldehydes is they show up in multiple parts of the process. So you can create aldehydes as you smoke the grain. You can create aldehydes as you ferment with the yeast interaction. You can create aldehydes in the barrel that didn't exist before fermentation. So esters, that's in fermentation. Aldehydes in fermentation, also outside fermentation. And that's where all of the first huge rush of flavors come in. I will say, you can completely alter a product by the yeast strain. This is why there are distilleries that have their yeast strain under lock and key and like cryogenically frozen in vaults in multiple locations around the world. So if something ever burns down at the distillery, they can still restart their process with the same yeast strain they have always used. You have brands like Four Roses who have worked aggressively on various yeast strains applied to different mash bills. It's everything. Now, there was an era in Scotland where everyone sort of ended up defaulting to a one yeast strain, and almost everybody used the exact same yeast strain, and I think it was called M1. That's changed these days, but if you went back in history, Scottish distillers just sort of used this one yeast, and that was the yeast they used. And American distillers were like all over the map with their yeast, and I think that was because a lot of American distillers came out of a culture of brewing, where yeast literally makes the beer, right? You want a different beer, you change the yeast, not just the grain. And so, and then there are distilleries that use like wine yeast specifically, like Balcones did one. There's some that have tried to do wild yeast, like Firestone Robertson did a pecan wild yeast that they captured, that they used in their fermentations for their bourbon that they made. And so there's a lot of really interesting things, but know that yes, yeast is a huge player. And when you're experimenting, if you just keep using the same yeast every time, a lot of times the things you think you created aren't coming from the grain, it's coming from the yeast you chose. And that is a very interesting thing that gets discovered sometimes by when you start to actually understand how fermentations function. It's a fun little exploratory process where you're like, oh, wow, that's why that happened. It's part of the fun in learning how to make things. Anyway, I hope that helps. We're going to talk about fermentation in a little bit later date. Cheers to y'all. I'm really glad you're here. If you like the wild yeast of the Whiskey Vault in your YouTube algorithm, then like and subscribe.